Good morning, everyone. We are working through some technical issues here, so the webinar will begin here in just 2 to 3 minutes. Please hang tight while we resolve the technical issues.
Paul, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Give it one more minute, I guess. What do you think?
Yes, that sounds great. I will give it one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay. Yeah. Anytime you're ready now is I'll be ready. I'll just wait.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Good morning, and welcome to the NATE webinar. My name is Paula Nurnberg, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of NATE. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Duane MacEntee. Duane serves as the Executive Director for the National Wireless Safety Alliance. He has enjoyed over 25 years serving in leadership, business management, and technical roles within the telecommunications, transportation, and aerospace industries. Duane has in-depth business knowledge of telecommunications infrastructure and has held executive roles for publicly traded telecommunication tower companies, major broadcast and wireless engineering, manufacturing, and deployment service companies, and leading providers of broadband, fiber, and microwave networks. Duane is a partner in the law firm of Barker McEntee, advising clients with respect to policy development, commercial and regulatory compliance, transactional due diligence, and business risk mitigation. Today, Duane will be presenting a webinar on Becoming NWSA Certified.
Thank you, Paula. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you on the webinar. Obviously, we have a lot of ground to cover this morning, and we're going to walk through a lot of very technical steps. My pace is going to be fast at times, and then I'm going to, slow down at some very critical points, which I think most of you would be very interested in. But before we get going, I'd like to go ahead and show a video, and that video is the most recent in a series of NATE Climber Connection videos. Many of you may have already seen it. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to watch, and if you're just on a phone, you probably won't be able to see the video, but you can always go to the NATE website and check it out. It's the Climber Connection video on Becoming NWSA Certified. It's 3 minutes. After that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Okay, pretty impressive video. Very good work by NATE as usual, and I want to make sure I thank NATE and their staff for the professionalism and the production there. It was really good. Okay, so just to kind of get started, we have a lot of material to cover today. If there's time, which I doubt there will be, honestly, at the end for a question and answer, we'll take some questions. But I would encourage you, if you have questions that come up throughout the presentation today, that you go ahead and send those in. The webinar has a function which allows you to send those in. We will be compiling those questions, and NWSA will try to get back to you as quickly as we can with answers. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this all boils down to, and you saw in the video, the candidate handbook. It really is the Bible by which the ground we're going to cover today. You really don't even need to take notes, and I'm sure that'll be a relief to many of you. I know I don't like to take notes if I don't have to, because it's all in the handbook. And you can always go to the NWSA website and get the handbook, download it, and if you already have it, please feel free to follow along. I'll be referring to this a lot, and you're going to see this slide crop up periodically throughout the presentation. So what are we covering today? We're going to go through an introduction of what it takes to become NWSA certified, the various policies, the computer-based testing component. I've highlighted the test outline because I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the outline for both the computer-based test and the written or the practical examination outline as well. Okay, so let's go with the introduction first. We have two programs that we're going to talk about today, the Telecommunication Tower Technician 1 and the Telecommunications Tower Technician 2 certification programs. Just to kind of abbreviate, you'll hear me say TTT1 or TTT2, maybe even T1, T2, because it's somewhat of a mouthful. But basically, the TTT1 is someone who can safely perform tasks on communication sites under direct supervision. And then the TTT2 is an individual who can safely perform tasks on the telecommunication sites and is capable of supervising technicians and trainees, the TTT1 level technicians. Just to give you a little bit of a background, when these programs were developed, the target for the TTT1 would be someone who would have like 6 to 9 months of field experience, and the TTT2 is someone who should have somewhere around couple years of experience. We'll say 2 to 3 years as a baseline. There are two pieces. There's the computer-based test, which is a written test, and a practical examination, which is a demonstration of skills and abilities for each of the T1 and T2 credentials to become certified. Those certifications are good for 5 years. Okay, the examination development process really revolved around the principle that it should be challenging but doable, especially with preparation, that someone should be able to pass these examinations. The computer-based test was developed by an industry task force, basically about 40 subject matter experts that got together every month for about 18 months. They also did the practical examination as well and put in thousands of volunteer hours. This task force included climbers, carriers, tower owners, contractors, safety consultants, trainers, you name it. It was a pretty broad cross-section of participation. We had some help though. NWSA teamed up with an organization called the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, NCCCO. NCCCO has been around for nearly 25 years, certifying crane operators, and they've become kind of the showcase, if you will, for accredited certification and credentialing in that industry, and NWSA is following their lead. CCO has come in to help us. They help facilitate the development initiative, and they're also partnered with NWSA in terms of the processing of testing as well. The NWSA accredits certified technicians that have a desire to become practical examiners under what's known as our Practical Examination Accreditation Program. So what are we not? Some of you might have seen this slide in other presentations I've done, but we're not training. We do not train. We have no inclination to train, nor are we permitted to, nor do we endorse any particular training pathway. NWSA does testing. That's what we do. Now, doesn't mean that we don't encourage good training. Obviously, we're in an industry that is very technical in nature, can be hazardous at times, and we want good training. That training can come from any number of pathways. Companies that have their own in-house programs, third-party training providers, community and technical college, and other things as well. So it doesn't really matter. All pathways can lead to certification at NWSA. So a little bit more, pointing back to the handbook that I'm going through today. You can find it online. This is our website, a screenshot of our website. The green arrow pointing to the button that gets you to the handbook and various forms that we'll be talking about today. As a reminder, you're going to see this slide a few times. So we have some policies. We have policies that need to be addressed in a number of ways. I'm going to go through a number of these in more detail than others, but you'll get the sense of it. Okay, so what's the eligibility requirement for a TTT1 and a TTT2? First of all, to become a TTT1, you have to have first aid and CPR certification and must have successfully completed an OSHA 10-hour. Those are delivered by OSHA authorized trainers. To become a TTT2, you have to have your TTT1 certification, including all the prerequisites. So, physical capability. This is not something that NWSA tests for in terms of determining a candidate's ability to actually do the entire job that an employer may ask them to do in the scope of work. What we do, though, is we ask candidates as they come to test that they attest, or that they tell us that they are capable of taking those tests safely from a physical standpoint. So while we're not assessing for their abilities physically to actually do a scope of work, we are asking that they tell us that they're physically capable to take the test. Okay, so now from a computer-based testing perspective, we have a couple of exams that are administered at what's called a PSI test location. There's about 450 of those around the country. Some of you may be familiar, especially if you've gone for your general contractor's license or electrician's licenses. These are locations that are set up to give tests for all industries, all kinds of industries. So we've partnered with them as well. The TTT1 computer-based test has 75 questions. They're multiple choice with 4 choices of answers, and you're allowed 1.5 hours to take that 75 question test. The TTT2 is a 90 question test, and 2 hours are permitted for that one. Okay, so now with the NWSA certification, there are time frames that you must be aware of. You have to pass a CBT and a practical exam for both the TTT1 and TTT2 certification. It doesn't matter which order you take those exams. You can do the CBT first, or you can do the practical first. Either way, doesn't matter. Just know that if you take one, you have 12 months to take the other one. You got a year in between. You have to recertify, and there's a 5-year certification valid date. They're good for 5 years. You must recertify within the last 12 months of that period before your certification expires. That's one of the rules here. So we haven't quite come up with what those recertification requirements are going to be yet. We're relatively new. NWSA started 3 years ago, but our testing and our first 2 programs have only now just become 1 year old. We've been in business for about a year giving those tests. Okay, so this is a pretty important aspect. Code of ethics. One of the reasons that NWSA is in existence is because of some uncertainty that existed in our industry about what is certification, what does a credential look like, how meaningful is it real? We have the belief, and the industry has said, we want an independent, portable certification that goes to the individual and is not tied to any given employer. But with that comes some responsibilities. Anybody who applies for and becomes certified has to adhere to our code of ethics. You can find it online, but there's a process, just to make everyone aware, that we watch to make sure that there's no violation of those ethics. We can, and hopefully don't have to, but we can suspend and revoke certifications if something warrants it. So what does that look like? Well, there are various things that an individual can be sanctioned for. Obviously, a violation of that code of ethics, which is you can find online, not renewing certifications in the time frames that are allowed for, falsification of information. That goes without saying. If you're lying, you can't be certified. And then culpability, meaning fault in an accident, could lead to disciplinary action of some sort. All right. So, what do the cards look like? I think some of you have probably seen these cards, and it's a laminated card. It comes to you with no cost for the first certification and for recertification. However, if you have to replace the card for any reason or update it for any reason, it's a $25 additional fee. The key component here that I'd call your attention to is the certification number goes to you. The person who passes the test gets that number, and that's the number that is your number. Regardless of how many more tests you might take, how many more certifications that might be offered that you pass, that's the number. and that www.verifynwsa.org is a very important, unique aspect of this. Anyone can go on that portal and find that number and match it up with those valid credentials. That's what that portal looks like. It's a very important benefit we see to the industry as a whole, to the professional technicians that have the certification, and to any prospective employer or customer that wants to validate those credentials. Hope to greatly reduce some of the fraudulent activity that's taken place in the industry in the past. Once again, just a reminder, you can find everything online. Okay, so let's get into some of the weeds, if we will, on computer-based testing. I'm going to talk about the process, the outline, and the reference list. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the outline proportionally, because that's what I suspect most of you want to understand is what's covered on the test. And these are the areas that we would go to. It's called the content outline, test outline. So first of all, we've got to talk a little bit about some of the process. As I mentioned before, you take the test, the CBT portion of it, at a PSI facility, one of 450 or so that are around the country. The application is made online. We highly recommend that you not wait till 5 days before a test date that you want to sit for, that you get in early, but at least 5 days, business days is preferred before you select a test date, that you apply before that. Once you do, you'll get an authorization email, and then you go ahead and schedule that with PSI. One enhancement we've made since launching, we heard from the industry that employers that are going to be sponsoring folks through this examination process would like batch applications rather than just one-off. We have that capability now. What's it cost? So the fees to take the initial test or retest for the written piece is $174 per certification, T1 or T2. There may be some other fees for replacement cards, and we talked about some of this. If there's reprocessing or something, a payment doesn't go through, there might be some handling fees there. Okay, once again, application fees are made online for the CBT. A little bit different when we get to the practical exam. I'll explain that at that point. Use a credit card. When you make application, that application is good for 1 year. But you have to take your test within that 12-month period, or the payment and fees are forfeited. Okay, so score reporting and test security. This is important because, once again, we're protecting the integrity of a certification that the industry is looking at as an independent certification. We're not tied to any training organization whatsoever. So it's really important that we maintain that. The results that you, when you sit for a CBT, you're going to get your results quickly. Immediately following the written computer-based test, you'll know how you did, whether you passed that exam or not. I would say, though, that the exam itself and all the questions belong to NWSA, and we need to protect them, and we will protect them. So copying or reproducing any of those questions and sharing them, we want to avoid cheating. So that's real important to understand that NWSA is very serious about enforcing those rules. So what's the scoring look like? Well, for both the TTT1 and TTT2, it's a scaled score, meaning that it's not a percentage. The number of questions right versus the number of questions wrong isn't exactly how it's done. The scale scoring is based upon a statistical analysis of the relevancy of the questions and how it ties to particular subject areas. So 100 is the baseline, and a score of 70 out of 100 on a scale basis is how we score. And I would also say, this is kind of an enhanced, nice thing. The CBT score report that you receive at the end of your test will show you get your strengths and weaknesses evaluation. So you know by content domain, we'll get into that in a moment, what that is, how well you did. Once again, it's all right in the handbook. All right, so let's kind of walk through a little bit of, and this is getting in the weeds here where we are. Want to talk about the domains. There are 6 what we call knowledge domains for the TTT1, and as a matter of fact for the TTT2. They're the same domains for both credentials, but they break out differently in terms of weighted percentages that the tests cover. So you can see job logistics, climbing, hoisting equipment and rigging, structures, appurtenance installation and maintenance, and equipment and special operations. The largest for the T1, TTT1, is climbing, representing 30% of the test. So let's dive in a little bit on some of these. Okay, so if you were following along in the handbook, it's page 8 of the handbook where you would find this information. But job logistics represents 19% of the test. And what's entailed in job logistics? Well, obviously, understanding the activities and hazards of the work site. That includes vehicle traffic, energized power lines, structure heights, tripping hazards, and basic job hazard assessment. Knowledge and understanding of the requirements for daily meetings and forums, site authorization, site security requirements, once again, JHA or job hazard assessments, and emergency action plans, how to know and understand those. Awareness of ongoing site conditions that includes things like housekeeping, fire protection, and unsafe conditions generally. How to orient, read, and interpret assembly drawings, awareness of the basic RF radiation requirements, knowing how to inspect, care for, and use appropriate PPE, very important, awareness of traffic control requirements and equipment for work on or near a roadway. Once again, all of that is in job logistics. Climbing, I mentioned that's the largest component at 30%. That's pretty straightforward for those of you that have been in the industry for a while. Understanding the requirements and use of fall protection, understanding the basic knowledge and skills required to perform rescue at heights, and this is basic knowledge for assisted rescue, self-rescue, that sort of thing. Understanding the standards regarding climbing facilities such as anchorages and attachment points. Knowing the requirements for safe use and inspection of stairs and portable ladders, and the ability to identify tools and hazards associated with controlled descent. Those are the elements of the climber portion of the test. Okay, hoisting equipment and rigging. Okay, so here we have knowledge of the requirements for the inspection and use of base-mounted hoist, capstan hoist, man-rated hoist, and obviously the requirements and regulations that go into personnel lifting. Know the elements of the personal platform operations. This includes what are the roles and responsibilities of the crew members relative to that. Equipment operation, loading, rigging, inspection and testing, that kind of thing, and certainly pre-lift safety planning. The test covers the knowledge requirements for tower-specific rigging operations. Once again, this is a T1, so it's somewhat limited in its scope, but rigging techniques, equipment, fall zones, hand signals are included in that. Knowing how to how the rigging affects structures. That includes, placement, location, loading, shock loading, that kind of thing. Knowing how to identify and apply ropes and knots, and knowing the requirements for the inspection and use of gin poles. Okay, moving forward, structures. This is a 10% of the test. Know how to safely approach communication structures and perform a job hazard assessment. Knowing how to identify the types and characteristics of structures, and that includes guide, self-supporting, and monopole structures. Awareness of the tools, means, and methods for routine maintenance and tower mods. Having awareness and being able to be tested on your awareness of the applicable standards and specs for the inspection of structures. Awareness of potential discrepancies in foundations. Could be a big issue when you approach a site, as you know, if you've been in the industry and depending upon where you are in the country and how old a structure is. The awareness of construction drawings and including the ability to identify materials by type, size, quantity, and sequence of assembly. And just a basic awareness of grounding systems as well. Once again, this is a TTT1 level. It's not meant to be a subject matter expert in all of these. It's an awareness, typically an awareness level. Then we get to appurtenance maintenance and installation. Knowing how to prepare, assemble, and install antenna and microwave equipment. Antenna mounts, how to prepare and assemble and install working facility, how to identify components of tower lighting systems, understanding and knowing how to install connectors on cable and fiber, hoisting grips, how to use them, and awareness on methods used to isolate and locate faults. Those are once again, basic ideas that are included in this. Continue on, obviously understanding how to adjust the tilt and azimuth of dishes and antennas. That's what we do. knowing how to identify and determine the tools and materials necessary to remove and install weatherproofing, and also various types of cables and connectors. A lot of tools and materials utilization here, identifying proper tools, installation of grounding systems, what tools do you use there. Understanding the hazards and electrical safety requirements of AC and DC electricity, awareness of the type and purpose and maintenance of tower-mounted equipment, and knowing how to identify coax color coding and its purpose. Pretty important, although may be basic, but it's very important information. Equipment and special operations. This is the 6th domain that we have here. It represents 13% of the test. Know how to safely work in and around aerial work platforms, how to identify harmful sources of energy, and knowing when and how to apply lockout tagout. How to identify and safely handle and transport batteries. Kind of a big deal in some cases in our industry. Know how to safely work in and around forklifts and other equipment. Knowing and understanding the types of equipment used and and the safety procedures that are related to them during demolition of towers. Knowing and understanding the equipment procedures and techniques associated with welding, cutting, and other hot work. Also identifying the requirements for exothermic welding. And knowing and understanding the types of equipment used and safety procedures related to appurtenance decommissioning, taking things off towers. Knowledge of jumper supports and spacing, and knowing how to properly use RF monitors. Now I'm going to pause for just a second. That's a lot to absorb. Those 6 domains cover a lot of areas. I would say that there are sample questions also contained in the handbook. I'm not going to go over those, but there's not a lot of them, but it kind of gives you the format of the questions that we're covering. And it's with some preparation, this is very doable. The feedback that we've received has been very positive in terms of the test itself. For those that have already taken it, have given us some pretty good feedback. Once again, pointing you to the handbook, it's all right there. So let's talk about the TTT2. There we go, it's a tongue twister. The knowledge domains are the same. They break out a little bit differently. You'll notice that climbing is not 30%, it goes down to 9%. However, the task force, the subject matter experts thought that heavily loading the T1 was the right way to go in that. And then hoisting and equipment rigging, that's 32% of this one. So obviously you can see where the focus is shifting there. So let's get into that. Similar type walkthrough. Page 10 of the handbook will get you to job logistics on the TTT2. 11% deals with understanding and directing the activities of the work site and the mitigation of hazards on the work site. Once again, vehicular traffic, those kinds of things. We talk about energized power lines, hazard communication, fire protection, that sort of thing. Recognizing and performing the requirements for daily meetings and forums. Now, this is performance, right? It's a higher level individual in terms of experience and certification, site security requirements, site client and owner notification requirements, emergency action planning, that kind of thing is real important here. Knowing how to orient, read, and interpret construction and assembly drawings, understanding RF radiation, very important. Knowing how to identify and evaluate and select and supervise the appropriate use of PPE, and how to identify and implement traffic control requirements. Okay, climbing. Climbing is about 9%, as we said before, and this is basically understanding and assisting in the use of fall protection. A little bit like Brother's Keeper. You know, the more senior technician on the site, kind of looking after others, making sure they're doing it properly, but also paying close attention to anchorage selection, attachment points, equipment selection, meaning proper use of lanyards, harnesses, connection devices, and climbing techniques. Not necessarily just of the individual themselves, but how do they kind of know what to look for in others and what they're doing around them. Very important. Knowledge and mastery of advanced skills and techniques used for rescue, meaning assisted rescue, self-rescue, planning for rescue, and response items. Understanding the standards regarding climbing facilities, and that includes ladders, stairs, step bolts, and inspection. Ability to develop and control a descent plan, part of the climbing domain. Okay, Hoisting equipment and rigging. Now this is a big one. This covers 2 slides actually on my presentation, and it represents 32% of the TTT2 CBT test. So, knowledge of the requirements for inspection and use of base-mounted hoists, capstan hoists, and man-rated hoists. Very similar to what you had in the TTT1, except this is a knowledge requirement for the inspection and use. Knowledge of the elements of personnel platform operation, roles and responsibilities of crew members, equipment operation, loading, rigging, inspection and testing intervals, pre-lift safety planning, etc. All that goes into that. Looking at the tower-specific rigging operations, rigging techniques, we'll get to it, equipment selection, equipment inspection, fall zones, hand signals, rigging plans. Rigging is a big deal. A1048 just came out last year and was approved last year. We have guidance in the industry around that. It's real important that our more senior technicians on site become familiar with the hoisting and rigging requirements more so than ever. We have some standards that we point to now that define that for us. Knowing how the rigging affects the structure, understanding and knowing how to identify and apply ropes and knots, and what the minimum requirements for the use of gin poles are. Minimum requirements. Okay, structures. That's the next on the list to cover, and it represents 17% of our test. So, with structures, knowing how to perform a pre-climb inspection. Many times, and this is coming from the subject matter experts, I was involved in the task force to a degree myself, and coming up on a site, pre-climb inspection, very important. As you know, this is a safety-centric certification. We want to make sure people understand that the tower is able to hold what we're asking it to hold. Know how to identify the types and characteristics of structure. Once again, guide, self-supporting, monopole, pretty straightforward. Knowledge of the tools, means, and methods for routine maintenance, for modification tasks, that kind of thing, pretty important. Understanding and knowing how to perform and being able to be tested on how to perform a visual inspection of a structure and the standards for that inspection. Understanding construction drawings, including the ability to identify the materials by type, size, and quantity, very similar to the TTT1, and the knowledge of grounding systems. Okay, so now we're on to appurtenance. This is domain number 5. It represents 15% of the test. Can be found on page 11 of the handbook for those of you that are following along. And basically, it's knowledge of how to prepare, assemble, and install and decommission appurtenances that include, things like tool selection, different types of antennas, dish, omnis, directionals, mounts, the various mounting configurations, grounding, AC and DC electrical, transmission line identification and support, and other tower mounted equipment that might be out there. Oh, there we go. I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. I kept. There we go. Equipment and special modifications. This is domain number 6. It represents 17% of the written test, and it covers, knowledge of working in and around suspended personnel platforms, the appropriate and proper application of lockout tagout, battery safety and precautions, knowing how to safely work in and around forklifts and mobile equipment, the awareness of operation safety procedures around tower demolition. Once again, that's something that's pretty interesting. I will give a note on this. There's also, moving right along here, helicopters, understanding the procedures and protocols for working around helicopters. Well, not everybody does that, and once again, the folks that develop the test understand that, trying not to make one-size-fits-all, or trying to make a one-size-fits-all approach. Had to mention it because it does happen. So understanding how to approach the craft, positioning and duties of the signalman, carrying tools, proper rigging of loads, hearing protection, that kind of thing. Just kind of keep that in mind. That might be something that you'll see on the test that you might not be that familiar with, and you can study up on. Awareness of operations and safety procedures required for tower demolition, pretty important. Knowing and understanding the equipment and procedures techniques associated with welding, cutting, and other hot work, very important. how to identify the requirements of exothermic welding, as well as understanding safe precautions regarding confined space entry. That's becoming more of an issue as we get into what I'll call non-traditional, maybe getting into vaults and other areas that might have a confined space component to it. So I'm going to take a breather, have a sip of water, and remind you again that the candidate handbook and everything is on our website. Okay, so references. These are the references for the TTT1 that we would use to develop the questions. NWSA's goal is for each of our questions on our test to relate back to a standard, or if not a standard, we certainly make sure that we have an industry consensus around what is that. But for certain, our goal is to make sure we tie those questions back to a standard that applies. Many of you will recognize many of these. Obviously, ANSI and OSHA are big in our industry. And honorable mention to NATE for their RF awareness booklet. That's in here as well. Once again, there are sample questions in the handbook that you can turn to and take a look at. How about for the TTT2? Well, it's a longer list. It's actually got 2 slides here, but same cast of characters, ANSI, OSHA predominantly. 1048, mentioned that, as well as ANSI Z359. OSHA, 29 CFR 1910 and 1926, those are the safety regs, and various other things. So you'll notice TIA 222 Rev G and the Crane Standard B30.26, those kinds of things. FAA, FCC bulletins and advisory circulars, and some DOT information as well. It's all there for you, and once again, pointing you back to the manual online. Okay, so that kind of takes us up to practical examination. We just talked about the written component, all this, the computer-based testing that you go to a PSI facility to take those. Now we're going to get into the practical exam where a candidate for certification goes to a site and actually does something with their hands and feet. So what's our process? What's, again, the outline for content and how to make application. So the practical exam process for the TTT1, just to get started, it's a 2-hour examination. It's conducted by a accredited practical examiner, and the candidate goes through 6 main tasks that are required to demonstrate skills and abilities in these areas, following instructions for assembly, proper usage of tools, putting on a harness, climbing techniques, signaling, performing, working at heights. Now, I will say working at heights is simulated. We don't put somebody up 200 feet on a tower. We simulate working at 200 feet, but it's very close to the ground on a training section of a tower or a testing section of a tower. Weatherproofing and tying knots are also included. Now, for the T2, it's 1 hour and a half. There are 5 main tasks required to demonstrate skills and abilities for complete PPE inspection, capstan hoist setup, and various in a hoisting operation using, excuse me, using a trolley tag configuration and a heel block straight tag configuration. Also, selecting and installing components associated with guy wire. Well, not everybody once again, not everybody works with guy wires, but following the instructions and getting through it, it's very, very doable. Okay, continue on. So there's a bit of a process here relative to the practical exam test site itself. Finding one can be a challenge. NWSA is here to help you with that. We have a list of locations that can be found on our website. Once again, you can also contact us directly and work with our staff to help pair you up with a test site and an examiner if need be. But this is a slide where I'm going to actually ask something of the audience. Those of you that have either become certified or are intending to become certified, I'd ask you to consider becoming a practical examiner. There's a workshop that we would put you through, and we'd love to have you as part of our network. Just let us know. Also, we need additional sites. There are a number of methods for getting certified or getting examined through a practical examination. One is you go to a site that your employer owns, and it's a closed site, and that's the way you do it. There are open sites, though, that are necessary so that we can increase the number of candidates that we can put through. If you have a location that you think is suitable, and once again, on our website, there's a specification under our Practical Examination Test Site Coordinator Handbook, which talks about the list of requirements. I would ask that you consider opening your site up to be an exam site for us as well. Just let us know, and we'd be happy to talk you through that process. I would say that on this, I want to also say that practical examiners and test sites may have additional fees that they would charge for certification. That's on top of the $174 and $100 fees that I mentioned before, and those are free market-based fees for their time and energy for conducting the exams. So you want to talk to your examiner and your test sites about that as well. We have no involvement in that process. NWSA does not. Okay, PPE requirements. Must use PPE, and candidates have to bring some things to these exams, these practical exams. Full body harness, twin leg fall arrest lanyards, positioning device, hard hat, safety glasses, work boots, and we recommend gloves for both, but it's only required for the TTT2. But they all have to be compliant. The harness and lanyards all have to be compliant, as well as hard hat, etc. Okay, so practical exam scoring, and this is kind of an important point to note. I mentioned it earlier, but the practical examiner that's conducting the test with the candidate that's on site, if you go to a site to take a test and the examiner is there scoring you, they have a clipboard and they're jotting things down as you're going through the motions. They're not scoring you, actually. They're recording what they observe. The scoring itself actually takes place off-site. So at the end of that exam, that practical examiner, who's basically a proctor for the test, is not going to be able to tell you how you did. They don't know. There's no way that they can know the way that this has been designed. So they're going to submit their observations on a record on this testing sheet to NWSA's testing services provider, that's NCCC, and it's going to be scored off-site. It's going to take a little bit longer. You're not going to be able to get the immediate feedback that you would on a written test at a PSI facility, but it goes through a process. For the TTT1, the passing score is 68 out of 100, and for the TTT2, it's 74. So it's not immediate response, like I said, from the CBT, but it's not too long either. It can be expected that probably within a week, within 2 to 3 weeks is when you would see the results from that. But there's some things that can get in the way of that a little bit in terms of logistics of getting the scoring sheets in and whatnot, and we try to get that done as quickly as possible. Okay, practical examination fees. I mentioned a little bit of that earlier, but it's $100 for the TTT1 and TTT2 tests for the practical examination. These are fees that are collected by NWSA. Once again, similar to CBT, there's some miscellaneous other fees if there's a replacement card or reprocessing required. Highly encourage you, as a reminder, to a word from our sponsor, go to the website and check out the handbook. Okay, the TTT1 tasks that are included, and this is found on page 18 for those of you that are following along in the handbook. If you are, you can go to page 18 and do a walkthrough with me on this. I'm going to hit the highlights of it for you. But task 1 is an antenna mount assembly, and that's done on the ground. It's a 4-foot antenna mount, and it's groundwork. You'd be required to assemble a 4-foot antenna to a pipe mount. All the materials and hardware are going to be provided to you, and a set of tools will be laid out on a table, and you have an opportunity to pick and choose the tools that you would want to use to put all that together. The antenna is going to be installed at a center line that represents a simulated 208-foot rad center. You'll be permitted to take measurements and ensure that the mount will fit properly while doing the work, but you're only working a few feet off the ground. As soon as you set foot on the tower section that's for the testing purposes, you're to assume that you're at 200 feet. So moving right, oops, sorry, didn't want to do that. Task number 2, that's basically preparing for work at heights and accessing the work location. All tools and materials, once again, will be laid out for you. and you'll get an opportunity to select and put the various items into a hoist bucket or your pouch. The antenna center line is going to be clearly marked for you, so you'll understand what that is, and the mechanical down tilt of that antenna is going to be listed. So you're going to have some work to do on the tower. You'll need to connect a jumper to a feed line as part of that process, and you'll have an opportunity to gather all tools and materials necessary to mount the antenna and to connect the jumper. Once again, you get to select the tools of your choice. Candidate will be asked to put on your PFAS, your personal fall arrest system, and describe to the examiner the process you're going through. It doesn't have to be an elaborate description, but you need to tell them what you're doing, why you're doing it, so they understand you get it in terms of putting on the harness. Proper climbing techniques will be observed, including 100% tie-off, and it must be used at all times. Okay. Task number 3 is mounting the antenna to the tower. You take and mount that 4-foot antenna to the tower leg, and it's going to go up, and you're just going to do it. You have all the tools you need right there. You get to pick them anyway. You might have more than you need. Just want to make sure you get the right ones. Jumper installation is next. You're going to be asked to install the jumper per a set of drawings that will be provided to you. So there'll be some drawings that'll be handed to you showing you how to install or what to install, and you'll need to do it per the drawings. Task number 5 is weatherproofing, and this is done on the ground, but it's a simulation of weatherproofing a feed line to a hard line connection. And there will be detailed instructions that will be provided, and that's what you would go by. Tying of the knots, there'll be 3 common knots and hitches that must be properly tied, dressed, and set. Okay, for the TTT2, that would be on starting on page 21 of your outline, or I'm sorry, the candidate handbook. Task number 1 is conducting a PPE inspection, and this is a complete inspection, and you will be asked to describe in detail on this one to the examiner the specific elements that you're inspecting. You'll be required to set up a capstan hoist, inspect it, set it up, and for test purposes, you're going to act as if the capstan would be mounted to the receiver of a truck. And then there's a process you would go through of describing securing the truck. There may or may not be a truck there, but you want to make sure that you understand what you need to do to secure the truck. So all this is in the handbook. Task number 3 is hoist load using the trolley tag system. And as I mentioned before, you're going to have a capstan hoist. You're going to lift a load using a trolley tag system. You're going to assume that load is 300 pounds, and you're going to configure that trolley tag system with the material provided to you during the test. The test itself, using a capstan, you're going to make a 6-foot lift of that load, 6 foot. Moving on to task 4, you're going to go through a similar process, except you're going to use a heel block with a straight tag configuration. So you're going to set that up using a capstan, configure the hoisting system. You're going to assume a 300-pound load again. You're going to configure it with a straight tag, and you're going to lift it 6 feet. So it's very, very similar. And task number 5 is the guy wire assembly and installation. And that's basically, you're going to assemble a guy wire following very detailed instructions and drawings that will be provided to you. So that's very important to remember. You've got detailed drawings to work from. For the purposes of the exam, the guy wire is not going to be tensioned, so you don't have to worry about that. And you're going to connect the guy wire to a pull-off that's mounted on the tower already, and you're also going to anchor it to an anchor head that's been secured on the ground. So this is all a simulation, and it's to represent that basically that you follow instructions, frankly. And so the feedback that we've received on that part of it is that even though some folks may not be that familiar with guy wire assembly and installation, it's very doable given the instructions are provided to you very well. So that said, we're going to go ahead and move on to what I consider to be probably, from my perspective and from a lot of folks, the most important slide of this whole deck, and it has to do with the safety briefing. As I stated before, we are the National Wireless Safety Alliance, and while this is not, as you can tell, just a safety certification that we're talking about, safety is very, very important to this whole process. A briefing is going to be given to candidates before they take their test, before they take the examination, and any unsafe acts that go on during the examination will lead to disqualification. I think it's real important to understand that at least at the time you take the test, that safe acts are expected. We're raising the bar here, and we really are very adamant about the safety aspect of this. So it's very, very important to take that into account. All right, so now what happens after the test? As I mentioned, the examiner does not know your overall performance and is not permitted to show you your scoring sheet or discuss any element of the exam. Basically, this is someone who is there. They will give you some instruction. You'll go ahead and perform the tasks. They will record what you've done and then submit it for scoring elsewhere. So they don't know, and they're not permitted to show any information to you during the exam or after the exam. Those scoring sheets will be submitted by that instructor to our testing services group, and then the results, once they receive those, will be sent out 12 business days from the receipt of that score sheet by that instructor. Once again, this does take longer than the CBT results. I will say that thus far it has not taken 12 days. In most cases, I will say there's probably some outliers there, but for the most part, it's done quicker than that. Okay, so if you go to the website and go to the handbook and forms, in the handbook itself is the application. And you can take a look at it here. It's kind of blurry. I apologize for that. You may not be able to see it, but this is the handbook, or I'm sorry, this is the application that must be filled out. It's from the handbook. I can't overemphasize, it must be filled out completely and signed and dated. Very important that all the information be put on that application. It just is, it's just necessary. So that's pretty much it with respect to the application and with the process. Frankly, that's the process in a nutshell. I know that we have gone through a lot of material in a very fast pace. Once again, I would just call your attention back to the handbook. Go through it, read it. If you have any questions or need any clarification on any of the points that are there, that are contained in there, there's an email address, and that email address is nwsa@nwsa-a.org. They will take that, and it's actually a live person that gets those emails. They look at what the content or the question is, and they make sure it gets put in front of the right person that can answer the question for you. So highly encourage you to take advantage of that as you have questions come up. With that, I will say thank you. Appreciate your time, and I'd certainly once again like to thank the National Association of Tower Erectors and NATE for allowing me the opportunity to share with you today. Thank you, and have a good day. Hope you have a good morning. Bye-bye.